Excellencies, distinguished guests, on behalf of Western Digital and UN Global Pulse, our partner, I'd like to welcome you to Data Innovation, Generating Climate Solutions. And I'd like to offer a special thank you to the Data for Climate Action Challenge partners for contributing data sets as well as data tools to our challenge event, as well as all of the participants in the Data for Climate Action Challenge. Together, we've clearly demonstrated that we can make data possible and create solutions from data. And as the leading provider of technologies and infrastructure focused on the capture, preservation, access, transformation of data, Western Digital is committed to making the possibilities of data a reality. And there is quite a bit of data, as you've heard. Right now, overall, 5 million bytes of data is being created every minute of every hour of every day for each man, woman, and child on Earth. That's 20 zettabytes of data this year. That's 20 billion trillion bytes of data. And a large degree of that growth is because the sources of data are changing and growing, as well as the role of data is changing and growing. Data is no longer just a record of a transaction or a profile of an individual or a log of measurements that have been taken. It's transformed into communications that we use on a daily basis, text messages, social media posts that go viral, as well as video streams. It's also used to drive productivity and efficiency, right, through automation of processes, or simply helping us navigate from one point to another. Or it's used for fuel for smart machines that work more reliably or more safely. And finally, it's starting to become a currency. It's starting to be an exchange of value between businesses and consumers, and also being used for social good. So every bit of that data, every little piece of that 20 zettabytes of data has something to say. And if we can bring together vast amounts of data from diverse sources, that data can provide a very rich, relevant, and compelling story to us. I'll give you an example of that and how important it is to be aggregating diverse data sets. I heard a story recently about a company that was involved in mining, copper mining specifically. And as the price of copper declined, they started shutting down their copper mines. And as the price of copper at later dates started to rise, they started to wonder if they should reopen some of those mines. But they had a large number of mines, and they would have to decide which ones to open. So from a business perspective, they want to make sure that their investment resulted in the highest yield, of course. And of course, because there's potential environmental impacts from mining, we want to make sure that we're not impacting the environment with a large return. So copper is essential for us to build our infrastructure, but we don't want to necessarily harm the environment unnecessarily, right? So what did they do? They went to a consultant and they said, can you help me? Can you help tell me which mines I should open first? And the consultant said, great, well, let me see the data that you've been gathering. And of course, they have information on soil samples and core samples and groundwater samples and adjacent water sources, as well as other geographical research that they had done. They turned that all over to the consultant, and the consultant said, that's great. And they analyzed it, and after some period of time, they came back to this mining company, and they said, we know exactly which mines you should reopen. And the company said, great. How did you figure it out? And the consultant said, we determined that the highest yield mines are directly correlated to lightning strikes. So these are diverse sources of data that made connections that weren't possible because as individuals, as humans, we have a certain bias. And to think about copper mining, we think that we need to look down at the ground, right? And no one would have gone to a weather monitoring source and said, where should we mine for copper, right? But yet, taking those independent sources, those diverse sources of data, bringing them together was the right solution. So that's an example of making connections that provide more precise and more prescriptive recommendations for better outcomes. But looking at diverse sets of data can also result in deeper insights, which can help drive the acceleration of breakthrough discoveries. And it can also be used to fuel real-time analytics to keep us healthier and safer. And it can also be used, of course, for social good. It has unlimited possibilities, and of course, social good is part of that. And through this Data for Climate Action Challenge, I think we've proven that we can use data for social good, for climate action. We've proven that we can create partnerships between the public and private sector to focus on this common interest, this common problem that we have. And we've proven that we can share data in a secure and trustful way. But the big challenge is that the vast amount of data that we have is sitting in the private sector, as you heard from the videos. And we need to encourage organizations to share that in a more open way so that we can harness the power of data and that we can use data innovation to come up with specific solutions that can help us. So as a company, Western Digital is committed to creating environments for data to thrive. And through the Data for Climate Action Challenge and this initiative and our partnership with the UN Global Pulse, we believe that we're also helping the planet to thrive, as well as all of our societies to thrive. And we look forward to continuing those efforts and broadening the partnership. So thank you again for being here. At this time, I'd like to introduce our partner, Robert Kirkpatrick from UN Global Pulse.
Thank you, Dave. Good evening to all of you. It has been a very long journey getting here, and it is thrilling to be here with you all, as Bob Orr said, celebrating what has happened and the amazing work that's been done by our winners today. So here are the Sustainable Development Goals. It's a challenging agenda, right? We have 17 goals, 169 targets, 230 indicators by which to measure progress. We have to implement this in a way that ensures progress is happening on all 17 fronts simultaneously, because they're all interdependent. And then we have to implement this in today's world, which is complicated and uncertain and changing constantly. And it's as if that weren't enough, the world of data has been completely transformed over the last 20 years, right? The Millennium Development Goals that preceded the Sustainable Development Goals were pretty straightforward from a data standpoint, right? It was survey data, census data, collected, owned, and used by governments, full stop. Most of the data that we believe will be necessary to achieve these ambitious goals in this world is data that is produced by people in real time, often without their knowledge, collected by machines in hundreds of thousands and millions of endpoints in the cloud, is owned by private sector and protected by IP issues and constrained by privacy issues, and yet still needed from an insight standpoint by public sector. So that's a very fragmented landscape in which to achieve the goals. Part of our work at Global Pulse is really to try to bridge these gaps, to try to create an ecosystem in which the insights can flow from origin to their destination and ultimately be used for better outcomes around the world. Very quickly, we're a special initiative of the Secretary General. We got started in 2010, really focused on big data as we looked at the challenge of how do we know what's happening in real time? How do we take the pulse of the world and measure well-being in real time? We turned to big data and analytics when, right after the term started to be used, said this is the only viable way to do this. We operate 3 data science and analytics labs around the world, our headquarters in New York, Pulse Lab Jakarta, and Pulse Lab Kampala, where we work with a variety of different partners in public and private sector and civil society. This is the core hypothesis behind Global Pulse, the one thing to take away if nothing else. This concept that as trillions of dollars have been invested in building the digital infrastructure of the world, people interact with in myriad ways as they go about their lives, the patterns left in that data can also be used to infer when they've lost a job, when they get sick, right? When they're struggling to afford food. Learning how to recognize those patterns and make them actionable is what drives us. almost 6 years ago now, we started reaching out to multiple industries around this concept of data philanthropy, as Bob noted, and it has taken off. I mean, there was enthusiasm right from the start, but many uncertainties about how to proceed. You guys really are the beginning of this movement now. The major players for this are in the room, and every time someone demonstrates the value of this, it moves everything closer to an incredibly important recognition, which is that not having these kinds of solutions already in use at scale around the world is incurring an opportunity cost for literally billions of people, right? You know, we think of big data as a new kind of natural resource or unnatural resource, right? Infinitely renewable, increasingly ubiquitous, but one that has fallen into the hands of what's been an opaque and largely unregulated extractive industry that's just beginning to wake up to the recognition that it has a social opportunity and perhaps a social responsibility to make sure that this data reaches the people who need it most. When we think about data, and someone says, you know, big data and human rights, we all sort of know what that means, right? We think, well, it's about privacy, right? Big data represents a huge threat to privacy if it's not managed correctly, because it's almost impossible to anonymize in some cases. But that's only half of the story, right? The fact that this data is not being used in 1/1000th of the degree that it should be to achieve every one of these 17 goals, that is a vastly more concerning human rights problem in the world, because these are rights too. We have been generating data for 10 years that could have been used to make our services smarter, our early warning system smarter, our disaster response smarter, better capability to measure the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of policy, and it hasn't happened. That's also a problem. So to give you, for those of you who aren't sort of deep in this challenge, I wanted to show you some of the kinds of data that are actually being used. This is a visualization that was done by one of our data partners, but many years ago. BBVA produced this visualization of credit card transactions in Spain over Easter weekend, I think in 2011. The point here is that they've categorized the transactions by type, right? You know, blue is groceries, yellow is fuel, red or pink is fashion, and red at night when it gets dark is alcohol. And you know, but the point is, any financial institution in the world can see in real time where people have money, what they choose to spend it on, how changes in the context and what happens in their lives drive changes in consumption. This data has vast potential to shape public policy as a feedback loop, and yet it is not being used systematically anywhere in the world. Why? Right? There are reasons, but we're going to change that together. So what we have here is an interesting quotation that's attributed to Aristotle periodically. May actually be valid, but saying we are what we habitually do. This is what's so exciting about big data, right? Is it lets you observe dynamics. It lets you understand human behavior in real time, and then through modeling, through machine learning, to predict it. As Bob had said, you know, this is really the critical piece with climate action. We're not going to be able to know that we're effectively changing how we interact with the climate system unless we can see it fast enough to take corrective action. What messages are resonating with people here, but not here? You know, can we see the patterns of consumption that tell us how quickly people are transitioning from incandescent lighting to LEDs, from furniture made from rainforest mahogany to furniture made of bamboo, right? We need to know this not on a time scale of years, but on a time scale of weeks as we implement programs. So data for climate action, I want to take you through some of the mechanics of the challenge, just so you get a sense of this very quickly, because you're going to see the consequences of this, what's come out of it now. The idea was to sort of combine the work that we've been doing in data philanthropy on a one-on-one basis with different companies, bring some of those companies together along with others around Goal 13. Goal 13 because it touches everything else, right? And the idea was that we would kind of open this up and try to move to a many-to-many innovation model, connecting the companies to researchers. Western Digital joined us 2 years ago, and it has been an incredible partnership moving this forward, and I think you'll be very pleased and excited when you see the results. So this is the basic concept. We've got to use the real-time information from these networks to understand the linkages between the human behavior and the climate system, and then end up with solutions that can actually be implemented, scaled, and used effectively. So by the numbers, because we're a numbers crowd, whether it's the climate people or the data geeks. So we had 11 companies providing data or tools, 97 semifinalist teams participating, 13 members of the evaluation community drawn from public sector, private sector, civil society, climate scientists, great group to whom we're very, very grateful. 32 submissions overall, projects from 10 countries, and the research teams coming from 16, and 6 prizes to be awarded today. You can see this was a 9-month timeline, pretty compressed, but we did manage to get the research teams with to have 4 full months with the data sets. One day we'd like to have them have more, but you'll see what they were able to do with 4, which is pretty amazing. So here are the companies, right, who stepped up and did this. You can see some of the types of data sources that are here. Microsoft and Tableau provided tools to allow these researchers and innovators to work with the data sets. This is where the teams were coming from, right? So we care about representation, geographic representation in the UN, great diversity here. These are the countries where these projects were implemented using data from these countries. Potential logical targets in some cases for an initial pilot, right? And nice distribution in terms of the thematic areas of focus for the prizes that we're handing out. Lots of interest in different topics. Many different academic institutions from all over the world. This is not a complete list, in fact. And finally, our evaluation committee. So we were looking at clarity, we were looking at credibility, we were looking at potential impact, and overall quality, right? Clarity, because if you can't communicate the value, it's never going to get implemented, right? It had to be rigorous science, but it also had to matter. Right? We did amazing science, but you can't use that. It doesn't matter. And finally, come back. Okay. And finally, 6 prizes. So 3 thematic prizes on adaptation, mitigation, and then climate and the other SDGs. So really looking at that interstitial space. 2 prizes for data visualization, and 1 grand prize. So we'll be starting with awarding thematic prizes and then move on to the others later in the program. But to get started with the thematic prizes, let me invite Dave back to the stage.